All right, hello again. Good morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night. You guys can watch these whenever you want, huh? So in this video, we're going to go through image processing, how to take a scan. This is actually a scan, but most of this is applicable to any images or a lot of different types of images. Of course, you can get images from stock photo companies, you can get them from scans, you can get them from digital cameras. So the process will be a little bit different depending on where your image came from. But we're going to do this one from a scan because it'll allow us to do some stuff that normally you wouldn't have to do, like straightening and cropping. So these are the general steps to get an image ready for a web page. You probably have access to a web page like this that I probably gave you if I was nice that day, if I was in a good mood, had enough coffee, that kind of stuff. You probably have it. So first thing, straightening and cropping. So we're going to do that. Straighten that image. Obviously, it's not straight, right? Then we're going to do spotting, retouching, dust, and scratch removal. So since this image was an old Polaroid, I think. Yeah, I think that's an old Polaroid. We're going to get rid of some of the spots on it from the scan. The next thing, number 3, is here, brightness and contrast, global tonal correction. Tonal means brightness. So it's just basically the brightness of the image. We may rearrange these a little bit. This is generally in the order you would do them, but we might rearrange a little bit. Or we might not have to do some of them either. So that's brightness and contrast. Contrast is the ratio of the dark to the lights. We will adjust that. Color correction. So we'll try to get rid of any color cast that the image has and maybe saturation. So we will probably do that. Then it says selective tonal and or color correction. What that means is global means in the whole image. Selective means in parts of the image. So we probably won't get to that, but if you wanted to change the color or tone of specific areas, you could spend multiple classes, multiple semesters on that kind of stuff. But that would be good for a Photoshop class, huh? Or a digital imaging class. But we're going to kind of go through the basics here. The next thing you would do is sharpen. So the last thing before you're getting ready to sort of output almost is sharpen. And I probably should rearrange this. It says suppress noise and artifacts, but that's mostly from overcompressed JPEGs and things, which this is not, so we don't have to worry about that one. So we'll sharpen it, and then we have targeting for print or optimizing for the web. So the process is different depending if you're going to print something versus the web. The web, I think, is a little bit easier, which is what we're working with most of the time because you can kind of see what it's going to look like. When you are getting an image ready for print, sometimes it doesn't look like what you think it's going to look like. So you have to do things like calibrate your monitor and do sharpening that you can't really see until it's printed and stuff like that. The rest of this page has instructions for 2 of the sharpening filters. One is called Unsharp Mask, which I'll try to remember to show you, but that is an oldie but a goodie. That's what a lot of people use for sharpening. Unsharp Mask. It originally, I think, was designed for scanned images, so it probably would work good on this one. But it is kind of an older filter. And then there's also and there's settings in there, or instructions for the settings. There's also sharpen using Smart Sharpen. So Smart Sharpen is more modernized. You can use it for images, for digital images, for scans, for anything. It actually even can mimic the process in the Unsharp Mask. So we probably will use that one, but we'll see when we get there. And so there's instructions for those too. So I'll get to a few of these, but maybe not all of them. So check out this page that I probably gave you a link to, right? All right, let's go ahead and get started. So here we have this image. It's obviously crooked, right? So what I'm going to do first is, oops, that's the wrong one. Here we go. Obviously what I'm going to do is rotate it. So I'm going to go to Image up here at the top and go to Image Rotation and rotate 90 degrees clockwise just to get it close to correct. So there we go. We got it 90 degrees to the right, which kind of made it at least upright, so they're not like on a space station or something. And then I'm going to click on the crop tool. So the crop tool is right here, or I could hit C on my keyboard. And one thing the crop tool has in Photoshop is a straighten tool. So up here at the top it says straighten. So if I click on that thing that looks like, I don't know what that looks like. I click on this little button here and then drag across the top and right across the top of the image. And what you're doing is you're telling Photoshop how to kind of align this image. And as soon as I let go, you see it kind of straightens out. So again, I clicked on crop, clicked on that button that said straighten, and then dragged across the top. You could also do it on the horizon if it was a landscape, or a building if it was a cityscape, that kind of thing. There you go. So now what we're going to do is, since it's been straightened already, but we're still in the crop tool, I can actually crop it at the same time. And it looks a little jagged and messed up, but that's just a preview. So I'm going to drag in until I get rid of the borders. I'm assuming I want to get rid of the borders right on the image. And then I'm also going to go down and use this grid. So this 9 by 9 or 3 by 3 grid comes up. And that kind of helps you with the rule of thirds, which is a compositional sort of rule of thumb, where if you place important elements about a third from the top of the frame or the side of the frame, it usually works out pretty well. So what I'm going to do is drag down a little bit, and so this line is kind of on most of their eyes, eye level pretty much. And what that does is get rid of some of this stuff up here, which obviously we don't need. That clock is pretty nutty, but we don't really care about that. So I'm going to drag down until their eyes are somewhere around there. And we probably don't need some of this side stuff either. So I'm going to drag in a little bit just to tighten it up and make them more the focal point. And then as soon as I get kind of what I want, you know, it's up to you. It's always up to you, right? I'm going to hit enter on my keyboard, and then now it is cropped and straightened pretty much. Looks okay. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You can zoom with command plus or minus. Remember up here, if we haven't seen this before, up here at the top, it tells you what your zoom ratio is. So right now I'm at 50%. If I go command 0, that will fill the frame. If I go command 1, it goes to 100%. If I go command, and anytime I say command, it's control on a PC, by the way. I can zoom out, command plus or minus. Another cool trick is I can hold down option or alt on a PC and then roll my scroll wheel on a mouse if you have one. Scroll wheel, I mean. You probably have a mouse. Maybe not. Maybe you have a laptop. And I can zoom in and out that way. So I'm just going to zoom. I'm just going to do command 0 so I fill that up. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of some of these spots. So I'm going to go over here to the spot healing brush. And what you want to do here is make a brush that is a little bit bigger, barely bigger than the spots you're trying to get rid of. So this image has a lot of spots. I probably won't even get to all of them. You should get to all of them in your example work here. But to make this video acceptably lengthed, is that a word, length? Probably not. I'm going to just do a few of these spots. I'm going to zoom in a little so I can see a little better. I've got this tool here, the spot healing brush. And I can use my square brackets, or I could go up here and click and use the slider, but I kind of like to use the square brackets, just kind of easier. So I'm going to use my square brackets. They're up near your P key. And then I just find spots and kind of click on them. Most of the time, the tool is pretty smart about looking around and using good places to sample from. So it's basically looking around for similar types of textures and colors and things, and then it is kind of copying it and the textures and colors, but not completely copying. That would be more of the clone stamp tool, which is an older tool. So if you get near an edge and it doesn't work well, let's see if this one works well by his hair. Maybe. There is another tool under here. I saw a little circle there. I don't know, maybe you'll see it, maybe you won't. I'm going to go to healing brush, which is very similar, except for a healing brush, you can kind of pick where you want to sample from or copy from. So I'm going to go to the healing brush, which is right underneath the spot healing brush. But this one, you have to give it a little bit of direction. So I'm going to go and hold down option. And you see how the cursor changes to like a crosshair? It looks like we're an assassin or something, or a video game. I'm going to click next to that area where that spot is and then click on the spot. It may have been a little better, but even if it wasn't, that's what that tool is good for. Is if you get near an edge and you're using the spot healing brush, which is pretty much automated. I mean, you have some controls up here that we'll skip for now, but if it's making mistakes and it's on an edge of something, you could try that healing brush as well. You can even drag a little bit. So there's one on it. Well, see, that didn't work very well. Let's try that other brush. It's healing brush. I'm going to go here, hold down option or alt on the PC, and then kind of drag over his hair. See, that was better, I think. Yeah, it's a little better. I'm going to go back to spot healing brush. There's a giant bug on his face. You can hit it again if that doesn't work. So you kind of get the idea, right? So I'm just looking around for spots. There's quite a few on this image, so I'm just going to do a few more and pretend that we did them all. But again, you should do them all, right? Because if you're putting this on the web, it has to look clean. I'm going to hit the biggest ones, I think. All right, that's enough of you guys watching me do that, probably. Ooh, there's a lot of bad ones, huh? Anyway, we'll ignore that. So you go ahead and do all that. I'm not going to do it because I'm lazy and I'm not getting paid by the hour. Now we've got that spotting done. So now we can do the color correction. So you could do the color correction. You could do the brightness and contrast. I'm going to do the color correction first. I think it kind of needs a little bit. So there's a lot of ways to do color correction. Hundreds probably. What I like, and for this image I kind of experimented before I did it, so I cheated a little bit. But there's a great tool in the Camera Raw tools, which you would know from Adobe Photoshop Camera Raw. It's also in Lightroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Filter, and I'm going to go to Camera Raw Filter. And what that does is open a big, gigantic, wow, it doesn't even fit at this resolution. Let's see if I can get it all on here. I guess I can. So this is Camera Raw Filter. It's just like opening something in Camera Raw, sort of, but as a filter. And Camera Raw, if you've never used it, is for processing raw photographs from digital SLRs. But it has a lot of great controls for things that are easier to use than other kinds of controls, if you ask me. So one is the white balance tool. So I'm going to go over here to white balance tool, which is the third one here, this little eyedropper looking thing. And I'm just going to click on it and then click up here on the wall. So what it's looking for is, what you want to look for is something that should be neutral. Neutral means some sort of shade of gray. So I'm assuming this wall was white. If it wasn't, this might be a little bit off, but let's click on it. It's a little bit blue, maybe a little bit. So now I can go over here to white balance, right over here, and I'm gonna slide a little bit to the right, just to warm it up a tiny bit. So warm means kind of towards the yellow, make it cooler as towards the blue. So I'm thinking that maybe that was a little too blue, at least the way I'm looking at it now. And of course, and white balance is a subjective thing. Obviously, if it's really far off, you know, people say, hey, that's really yellow or really blue or something, but it's really up to you. You know, if you want more friendly and stuff, you can go more warm. If you want kind of cold and impersonal and scary, you can go blue. But I just went to the right just a little bit on this color temperature slider over here on the right. While I'm here, I'm going to do two more things because they work really well inside this filter. I'm going to go down to clarity and slide to the right a little bit. And that kind of makes the mid-tone contrast a little bit higher. What does that mean? It means if I go really far to the right, you'll see it. It kind of makes it look like you're sharpening. It's not technically sharpening, but it feels like it. So I'm going to go to the right a little bit on clarity, to the right a little bit on contrast. And then I want a little bit of saturation for these colors, but I don't want to do saturation because saturation does all the colors and things start to look kind of radioactive. So I'm going to do vibrance instead. And what vibrance does is it adds saturation to colors that aren't already saturated. So you don't get oversaturation as much. It's almost the same, but a little more subtle. So I just slid that over a little bit. So I slid contrast over to about 10. Again, this is all kind of up to you, but I slid contrast over to about 10. I slid clarity over to plus 13 or so. Maybe I could go a little bit more, maybe plus 20. And then I slid vibrance over to plus 17. If you want to do adjust the brightness, you could do here under exposure. I'm gonna say that's pretty good. That's kind of what I want. You know, again, it's up to you normally, but for our case, for this example, we're gonna use those kind of numbers there. And when I say okay, it applies that. So I'm gonna do, this is before and after. I'm doing Command Z or Control Z on a PC to show you before and after. See how it got a little bit cleaner and the color is kind of fixed. It might still be a little blue, but I think it's pretty good. Another way you can do it, and we can actually do it on top of it, although you should probably be careful a little bit with it, but I'm going to click on this button down here, which is the adjustment layer button, and go to, it looks like a black and white cookie, I always think. Click on that and go to levels. And here is where we're going to adjust the contrast. I could have done that in that other filter, but I wanted to show you adjustment layer instead, because it's a different way to do things. So the great thing about an adjustment layer is it sits above your background layer, or image layer in this case, and it does not affect the layer below it. So what we did before when we did that camera raw filter, that actually changed pixels kind of permanently, but this won't, because we can always turn it off or turn it on or readjust it. So what I'm going to do is I've got this levels adjustment layer there. Remember, I just clicked on this and went to levels to get to that. And then I see this histogram, which is a plot of my image's brightness. And what you usually want, not always, depending on the image, but what you usually want is you want these black and white point sliders here to start and end at the edges of where there's image data. So I'm going to drag this black slider over a little bit and this white slider over a little bit. If you go too far, you get nuclear holocaust, right? So you don't want to go too far, because it'll overdo it. And you're kind of redistributing the brightnesses in your image. So actually, if I go to Window and show histogram, there's my histogram right there. And then I'm going to click on this again. Double click, and I got them both hidden. Well, let's see if I can get them both on there. Let's do it this way. I'm going to go to histogram, and I'm going to put it over here, right there. And now I can see my histogram, and that's a plot of my after, sort of my after plot, and this is my before plot. So watch this histogram as I go slide that one over. See how it is all empty over here? But if I do this, it kind of fills up the space. Now I get these little holes in here. That means you're kind of getting a little bit, maybe if you have too many of those, it's sort of posterizing. You're getting like solid colors, which you don't want, but I think we're okay there. All right, so there I adjusted the contrast using the levels adjustment layer. So I can kind of close that up probably. And then I'm gonna go back to layers here. So there's my levels adjustment. If I change my mind, I can just double click on that and it'll reopen and I can readjust it. Or I could just turn it off with the eyeball and now it is turned off. It's back to where we were before we did that. So that's good. All right, we are almost done and ready to save this thing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sharpen this image. And so what I'm going to do, I have to do that on my actual background layer. Now I could do this with a smart object or change it into a smart object so I can filter it, but to save time, I'm just going to be lazy and duplicate this layer. So I'm going to do Command J. You can also drag it down to the new layer icon. Same effect. The reason I'm doing that is because since I'm sharpening, it's again changing the actual pixels, and I want kind of a unsharpened copy underneath just in case. Okay, so I'm going to go here and make sure I'm on that layer on top there, and I'm going to go to Filter and Sharpen and Smart Sharpen. I think we'll use Smart Sharpen. And so I've got Smart Sharpen open. There might be a button that says Advanced, which I think I may have already turned on, or maybe there's just a drop down. It kind of this dialog seems to change quite a bit, so you might see a slightly different version. But so I've got controls up here at the top, and I've got remove here. So this one is kind of it's kind of easy to miss, but if you choose this remove Gaussian blur, it actually acts like the unsharp mask and uses the same sort of process. If you click on remove lens blur, it's thinking it's a photograph and it's going to try to look for edges. So basically what all the sharpen tools do, or most of them do, is they try to increase contrast at the edges of things. Some of them look for edges and some don't. Well, they kind of are looking for edges. So if we go back to here, let me take you back to this page that we were looking at. So here is the controls, or the Smart Sharpen controls, and there's a bunch of settings here, which it's easier to kind of look here than kind of explain it over here. So the amount sets the amount of sharpening. That makes sense, right? The higher value increases the contrast between edge pixels, giving the appearance of greater sharpness. So it's not really Sharpening? It's more increasing contrast on edges. So it's important to remember. You can't get, well, you kind of can get, but you really can't get a sharp image out of a super blurry image just because the data isn't there. The image isn't there, right? So radius is the number of pixels surrounding the edge that are affected by the sharpening. So that's what that radius slider is for. The higher the radius is, the more obvious the sharpening, and you could get sort of a halo effect. Reduce noise, that is more for digital images that have noise in them. That could be from a high ISO camera or high ISO shot. That would be mostly what that's for, or low light situation. And then this is the part that talks about how those three settings work. Gaussian blur is the same as unsharp mask, pretty much. Lens blur detects images in detail in an image and has more finer sharpening of details. So that's more modern than this other method here. There's also a motion blur one underneath that too. So let's go back here. Here's the motion blur. That would be more if you have like a directional blur that you wanted to get rid of. So we don't really have that. We're gonna leave it on Gaussian blur because even though this was shot with a camera, we're looking at it as a scan, right? So the amount depends a little bit on your image, the resolution of your image. So sometimes Photoshop gurus will tell you to start at over 300, which in this image makes it look kind of a little too nutty, and then start to increase the radius until you start to get halos. So there's definitely, see, I can make it ridiculous, right? That's the halos, right? So then you back that off until the halos go away, and my computer is a little bit slow in redrawing it, but I'm actually thinking that's too much. So I'm gonna go down below around 260. You kind of sharpen the taste here a little bit. So I'm at 100%. We're not gonna look at it that big. Down here it says 100%. We're not going to look at it that big on the, I have to track my time. We're not going to look at it that big on the web page, so I'm zoomed in pretty far. Let me zoom out a little bit. I can zoom out right here. So actually that looks pretty good to me. If I wanted to fine tune it a little bit, and I could probably turn out this reduce noise because I don't think there is any noise. I don't think, because, well, maybe there's a little bit. I could put a little bit in there. If I wanted to fine tune it, I would open the shadows and highlights, and that's where you can sharpen or not sharpen the shadows and highlights different amounts. So tonal width is like how much of the shadows it's going to sharpen, and then the radius is the same as this radius, and fade amount is how much it's going to fade out the effect of sharpening in the shadows. So I'm probably just going to leave those alone. You can check out those controls later if you want to, but I think this is fine the way it is. Okay, so I think we're good. I'm at about 227 as far as amount, and again, you kind of sharpen the taste a little bit, and then the radius is 1.5 pixels, and then the noise I've got it about 6, but again, it depends on your preferences a little bit. So I'm going to say okay. And then there is my before and after. Now I'm just clicking on the eyeball to show you the before and after. And you can see how it looks quite a bit sharper there. And I could have done this in Camera Raw, and I could have done this 100 ways. There's all kinds of crazy techniques. Multiple filters. There's a sharpen tool. There's all kinds of stuff. But that's probably fine for this. All right, so the last thing we have to do, what I'm going to do is save this image. I'm going to go to File and Save As. And the reason I'm saving as is I don't want to overwrite my original file because I've definitely changed some of these pixels. So I'm going to say, I'm going to call this image processing 2. And I'm just going to save it on my desktop. You could save it wherever you want it, obviously. And I don't want to save over my original, as I said, because if I did, then I would lose that original image, which was this one, right? And then if I change my mind, like, oh, I sharpened it too much, or oh, I didn't do something that I wanted to do, and I want to go back, but I've already overwritten the file, you lost that file, right? So always, it's generally a good idea to save versions of things. There's other ways to do it too, but versions of things is time-honored and a good idea. All right, so here's my image. So what I'm going to do now is resize it a little bit. So I'm going to go to Image and Image Size because this is too big for my web page. I'm pretending this is going to be on a web page, right? And I'm going to go to Pixels, and let's say that I wanted this to be 600 pixels wide. This resolution really doesn't matter most of the time for web stuff. So I'm only worrying about the actual pixel dimensions. So I'm going to say 600 by 467. Actually, let's go 800 so it's big enough to see. That's pretty big for a web page, but we'll pretend just because we want to see it a little larger. And then I'm just going to say OK. So now I've got it at that size. Actually, this is the actual size. If I zoom in, that's 100%. Still pretty big. And this only looks huge because I've got this my monitor set to a low resolution so I can video this for you guys. So it's really it'll be smaller on your monitor, probably more like that, right? Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is save this out for web. So I like this. If you go to File and Export, there is Save for Web, which is being phased out a bit. They're not kind of updating it anymore, but I always liked it because you could see like 4 different versions of your image and try different settings over here. And it is pretty complicated. There's a lot of different options here and things, and they're kind of phasing it out a little bit. So we'll go with what they're kind of going with now, Adobe, I mean, by going to File and then Export and then Export As. So this being a Photoshop or an image, photographic type file instead of a sort of a graphic file, probably the type of image you're going to use is a JPEG up here. So you just pick your format up here. This image, this dialog is obviously a lot simpler than the previous one. You have 4 options. You got PNG, JPG, GIF, and SVG. And I think we've talked about most of these in a different video, so I'm not going to bother with that. So I think this is going to be a JPEG. I don't need transparency, so a PNG file is probably going to be too big. And I don't want to use a GIF because it's got too many colors. It's a photograph. So I'm going to go with JPEG. As far as quality goes, if I go to 100, you can see over here it says that it's 569 kilobytes. It looks the same as my image, but the file size is kind of big. If I go to 0 and I zoom in here a little bit, I'm going to zoom in again. You see how I get all this blocking? That's called macro blocking, and that's not good. So most of the time with photographs, you want to be maybe a little over 50-ish and see how it looks. Now I'm zoomed in again. I'm at 200%. I'm going to go back to 100. Maybe 50, 70, somewhere in there. Again, it's up to you. So part of your job is to evaluate this quality and this size that results from that with the quality of the image. That's why that Save for Web was so cool, because you can put in different settings. But anyway, we'll say that, you know, it looks good at around 65-ish. You don't want to usually be right below 50 because it actually, you get a lot of improvement if you go slightly over 50. You could go quite a bit below 50, like 35 if you wanted to, but you'll start to get sort of haloing around things. See the halo around his head if you go too far. So I'm going to go with about 60-ish, somewhere around there. The image size I'm going to leave the same. The canvas size I'm going to leave the same. You can, during output, during this phase, change the size if you wanted to. I'm going to leave this convert to sRGB on because that is kind of good for web stuff, so I'm going to leave that on. Over here on the right, it's set to 1 times. That means it's only going to save a 100% sized image. If I clicked on this little plus, I could have it save a 2 times image or a half size image if I wanted to. So let's say I wanted a 2 times image. Well, I wouldn't do that probably. Let's say I wanted a half size image. I'm just going to show you what it does, and I'll just do that. What this is for is when you're making apps and things, or sometimes you're doing responsive web design, you want different sized versions of the same image. It's not great. It wouldn't work great with this image because it's more of a photograph, but sort of graphics and things, you might output at different sizes depending on where it's going to go. But I'll just do a 0.5 to show you what that looks like. All right, I think we're good. So I'm just going to say export all. And then it's going to ask me where. I'm going to go on the desktop and click on new folder, and I'll click on, I don't know, I'll just type family for a new folder. I know I went kind of fast there. I clicked on new folder down here, and then I typed family. And I'll say export. And you're like, what happened? It goes back to your image, right? Which you could save as is here. So I'm going to go to File, Save again in case my computer crashes, which is a possibility, right? And here's my original. That's my original. Here's where we were at the end. And then if I look on my desktop, which I'll get that for you and bring that over. Here is my desktop. Here's the family folder. And here is the image. So there's the original, or that's the optimized JPEG. And here's the half size one. So what that does is it allows you to output multiple sizes of the same image. And sometimes you'll do that with background images on websites. Sometimes you'll do that on apps where you need a double-sized image for high definition displays like iPhones and most cell phones now. So that's kind of what that's for, but you see it automatically output that, and it put an extension on there, and you can obviously change that. But one is obviously the bigger one's bigger, it's 125, and the smaller one's 40 kilobytes. So that is how that works. So that's the simple way to export it. There is even one more quicker way to do it. If I go to File, Export, and Export Preferences, I could change my preferences as far as quality goes and settings. So maybe I change this to, I'll leave it at 80 actually. This is JPEG and quality 80 now. And then it says I can tell it to ask me where to export it each time. So I'm just gonna leave all that and say okay. And then now I've got my image, same image is open. I'm just gonna go File, Export, Quick Export as JPEG, and you see there's no ... That means it's not going to ask you anything except for where to put it. So I'm going to say quick export as JPEG, and I'll call it image processing 2-2. It went to the same folder that I was already in, save, and I'm done. So that is how you can really do fast kind of, if you're in a production environment, maybe you're in web production or something, and you need to work really quick. That's what you might do, but you'd set up your settings the way you want it every time. Obviously, didn't ask me what my settings would be. I just did it. So here's the one I just made with those settings. And since I was at 80 on that one instead of 65, the file size was 227 versus 125. Quality is going to be a little better, but the file size is going to be bigger too. So, all right. So I think that does it for image processing and preparing an image for the web.